Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, dear colleagues, my name is Wolfgang Knöbel, and as director of the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, I would like to welcome you to tonight's talk by Professor Jedediah Purdy. Those of you who have listened to and watched the talk of Katharina Pistor last night know that the streamed lectures came out of a conference that was planned by Professor Ralf Michiels from the Max Planck Institute for Comparative and International Private Law, located at the Mittelweg here in Hamburg, and by Professor Tobias Eule from the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, ladies and gentlemen, which is located at the same street. The conference on the topic Law and Capitalism should have taken place last year in order to remember the 100th anniversary of Max Weber's death, who has passed away in 1920. But due to COVID-19, this international workshop had to be cancelled, and so the two organizers decided to stream parts of the planned conference lectures individually, which was started last November, was continued last night by the talk of Katharina Pistor, and will be continued in a few minutes by the presentation of Jedediah Purdy. Of course, we would have liked to see you all here in person, but complaining about the circumstances doesn't help. So we should rather see the advantages of this virtual event, which means that everything can be streamed all the more perfectly, we hope, on the internet and watched all the more relaxed on local television, TDTV, at a later date. Today's speaker is certainly not known to everybody in Germany, but at least known to quite a few due to the fact that Jedediah Purdy is one of the most important public intellectuals in the US, which also means that he also plays an important role in intellectual debates in Europe and in Germany. No wonder then that some of his books have been translated into German, and I'm quite sure some of you have read his books, which have appeared over the years. I would like to mention three, which also characterize Jedediah Purdy as a brilliant intellectual with an enormous sensitivity to societal trends and conflicts. Das Elend der Ironie, published in German in 2002 and written before 9/11 by a young philosopher in his early 20s, was an attack against the arbitrariness of political and normative standpoints, an attack on the assumption that everything also could be seen differently and that politics is merely a play in which really nothing is of importance. Only a few years later, he published Das ist Amerika, Freiheit, Geschäft und Gewalt in der globalisierten Welt, which is not only a reflection on the self-understanding of America in a globalized world, but also in a Tocquevillian manner, a view on America from the outside, about the way how people in different parts of the world are perceiving the American way of life. And only most recently, in 2020, another book by Purdy was translated into German and published, Die Welt und Wir, Politik im Anthropozän, in which Purdy theorizes in a general way the connections between ecological and political questions, and in which he again reflects on America's colonial past and the use of resources in his country. The different topics dealt with in Purdy's oeuvre certainly make him one of the most important intellectual figures worldwide, but before you become a public intellectual, you normally have to make a proper career as well. And in this case, Purdy is no exception, since his academic achievements are also truly outstanding. Jedediah Purdy finished his legal studies at Yale Law School in 2001 and managed to follow a successful career as a legal scholar, despite his many activities as a writer and publicist. He was visiting professor and fellow in an enormous number of prestigious institutions. In 2004, he became assistant professor at Duke Law School until he became full professor of law at this institution in 2009. 2016, he joined Columbia Law School, where he is now the William S. Beinecke Professor of Law and thus a colleague of Katharina Pistor. There's no way to point to the numerous books and articles written by Purdy. I just would like to mention one book, that came out quite a long time ago, but which is still very influential and important, not the least important for the topic of law and capitalism. The meaning of property, freedom, community, and the legal imagination, which was published in 2010 by Yale University Press. Therefore, please look forward with me to Jedediah Purdy's lecture, which will be commented on by Professor Ralf Michels, who is the director of the Max Planck Institute für Ausländisches und Internationales Privatrecht here at the Mittelweg in Hamburg. Ralf Michels is, at the same time, Global Law Professor at Queen Mary University of London and Professor of Law at the University of Hamburg, and one of the outstanding figures in the fields of private and comparative law, so that we can looking forward to a great discussion, not only between Michels and Purdy, but also one which will involve the viewers on YouTube or on Zoom who might have their questions to be answered by Professor Purdy as well. But first, the lecture. Please, Professor Purdy, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Knobel. Rolf Michels, as I have known him for years as a colleague, Tobias Eula, and everyone else who has made this virtual event possible. It's a great honor to be speaking to you today, and I thank you for the invitation and for the work to make it real. I'll be speaking about the law and political economy movement in American legal scholarship, a burgeoning tendency in the American law schools with which Katerina Pastor and I have been associated, as has David Graywall, Amy Kapczynski, Sabil Rahman, to name some of our participants. It is, I think, a defining effort in the study of law to come to grips with the crises and transformations of the early part of the 21st century. And it is something in which I have a hand. So it is that for which I will be a kind of ambassador today. I hope an ambassador capable of a modicum of critical self-reflection. The law and political economy movement, which I'll be calling LPE for short at times, has been associated with a set of claims so elementary that it may be surprising that they've seemed controversial or even worth making. With that downbeat meta introduction, let me give you some of those claims. First, that the economy is thoroughly constituted by law. Second, that the way in which it is constituted raises significant issues of distribution concerning both control of resources and control of power, which are, of course, closely and reciprocally interconnected. Next, that the power whose distribution we're discussing includes multiple dimensions. The simplest is that over the lives of other individuals, such as employers toward actual or prospective employees, landlords toward tenants, and of course the reverse, an example that makes a general point that power is not one directional or one dimensional, but pervasive, multiform, and relative. To point it out is not to denounce it, nor necessarily to complain, but to seek a clear description. A second dimension of legally constituted power is over the shape of the market and the allocation of opportunities within it, such as that which Amazon exercises towards small vendors, creators, and customers. A third is power over the shape of investment and innovation. For example, technologies of pervasive employee surveillance and control, issued to increase profit margins, rationalized in the name of quality control, are rewarded by a conjunction of intellectual property law, antitrust law, and labor law. All of these help Amazon to be Amazon and create a market for the technologies that make Amazon even more so. I take it merely as an example, not as a primary target. A fourth dimension of legally constituted power involves the translation of all of these forms of economic power into influence over the agenda of public life, political power, not only in the notorious direct sense that the very wealthy dominate political donations and influence, or that large capital concentrations can cajole, threaten, and overawe public officials, but also in the subtler sense that new media technologies since the 1990s have found ways to commodify resentment and disinformation as saleable goods that produce and cater to defensive and alarmist forms of identity. This was already true in the US as early as the 1990s with right-wing talk, radio, and cable television. It's now been generalized and perfected by Twitter and other social media, and it must be said, by left liberal and left-wing cable and talk radio. Even the political identities, then, of citizens are substantially produced via for-profit platforms in which their sentiments and commitments represent a certain predictable vector of return on investment. These examples, the last in particular, highlight another point about power. In making the economy, the law doesn't simply enable some people to do things to others, or even some entities, Koch Industries, Amazon, the Soros Foundations, to wield certain kinds of influence. It sets in motion larger logics, which may not be wielded intentionally or with complete intention or understanding by any agent, individual or collective. Logics involving the definition of value and means of profit seeking, the modes in which we're intersubjectively constituted. In short, while law enables people to do things to other people, it does much more. It makes worlds. It makes the worlds that make worlds. So for those of us who have been involved in the first chapter of the Law and Political Economy movement, it seems that the shape of economic life presents a political question of the first importance. That when we talk about citizenship or social membership, we should talk about material security, control over the shape of our days, how we spend our energy and work together, how wealth is defined and produced and allocated. And we should ask whether we're making institutions that are commensurate to the social and ecological crises that our present world is busily creating. It has seemed to us as students of law that there may be many ways of answering these questions, but that any way of approaching law's role in constituting economic life that promises a uniquely correct answer, especially an answer that evades or conceals some of these same questions, must be suspected of unhelpfulness and even of ideological obfuscation. As I said, I hope that much of this will not seem so very surprising. For us, though, it took some time to find the ways to say it. And in elaborating that thought a little, I want also to historicize a bit the movement and the moment from which I'm speaking. The generation that created the law and political economy movement, largely in our mid-30s to mid-40s, grew up immediately after the end of history. And although hardly anyone ever used Francis Fukuyama's grandiose phrase without a sense of irony, the world turned overwhelmingly to the conclusion that the phrase crystallized, that liberal capitalism was the only non-barbaric future. With questions of collective order seemingly resolved, the scope of politics was dramatically compressed. There was then a political drama of a sort, a certain romance of human rights, a passion for direct service and for what was called speaking truth to power. But political and cultural critiques of capitalism had become intellectual history, while even the ecological critique of capitalism was pressed to the very margins. There was really no truth to speak against the market's decentralized and quasi-voluntary forms of power. Markets were just there, morally neutral, in the logic of things like gravity. The most one could confront them with was a socialism of the heart, a phrase on which the Czech president and playwright Václav Havel and the English folk singer Billy Bragg converged at about the same time. The American conceit of that time, in which most of the LPE generation grew up, was that the rest of humanity was waiting to become us, to shake off the accretions and abuses of history and to become just people, unmodified, like us, maybe with different clothing or different spices. And such people would, beyond doubt, live in a marketplace as pervasive and invisible as the air. They would also live in plenitude. The American supermarket was the cornucopia at the end of history. An irony of that time was that, while a revolt of capital had beaten liberal egalitarianism at home, capital's global expansion seemed to promise a renewal of liberalism and perhaps a redefinition of egalitarianism. The increasingly open flow of goods and investment took place, like any other market, through legal institutions that had required political construction, but the mystification that surrounded economic globalization would have embarrassed a 19th century devotee of the natural, quote unquote, marketplace. Bill Clinton supported China's accession to the World Trade Organization by arguing that globalization was, quoting, the economic equivalent of a force of nature, like wind or water. In 2005, Tony Blair, scolding critics who wanted to debate over the terms of globalization, said, "You might as well debate whether autumn should follow summer." You might say that in the age of climate change, we are debating exactly that, or failing to debate exactly that while deciding it. But that's another question. This diffuse impression was tied into several more explicit ideas, which added up to a kind of rough and ready modernization theory. Its first premise was that when you came down to it, everyone everywhere wanted the same future. People wanted the goods of consumer capitalism and the mobility, self-expression, and other post-traditional privileges that went with them. And with these satisfactions came a new kind of personality, the pragmatic, easygoing, tolerant disposition that the Baron de Montesquieu long ago identified with doux commerce, the softening, sweetening influence of commercial life. From Coca-Cola, it seemed a very short step to liberal individualism of the market society variety. Second premise was that this personal and cultural market liberalism would find social and institutional expression in legal political liberalism. Market individualists were, quote unquote, middle class, and this meant they would want to have their personal rights and property protected, liberalism, and expect some voice in politics, moderate democracy. The systematic protection of middle class rights, along with political feedback from this consummately self-interested yet responsible class, would press governments toward the rule of law, which in this setting meant the creation, extension, and protection of relatively impersonal and non-corrupt markets. The market really was natural, it seemed, not because it didn't depend on the state, but because a natural unfolding of social history brought about the kind of state that reliably maintained market order. And so we came of age in a time and in a place gripped by an extraordinary kind of imperial self-image and a lack of self-awareness, as intense, perhaps, as if growing up in the middle classes of late Victorian England. But if the English had somehow conspired with themselves to avoid noticing that they held an empire. It was in this culture that we went to law school. Most of us in the US. And the jurisprudence, the legal scholarship, and the pedagogy that we encountered there were all involved in this larger self-image that I'm trying to portray historically, in ways that we came slowly to understand naturalized a certain role in law for the market. It's that naturalization that we've tried to tease out and pick apart and shed light on in what I called the first chapter of the Law and Political Economy movement. The naturalization came in many forms, some as specific and textured as what counted as an interesting question, a sound instinct, a cogent observation. Hegemony is sometimes a matter of what you think to say or don't think to say, and how you learn the difference. But the legal naturalization of the market was also more architectonic. As students, we encountered a law whose work had been distributed across two great domains. One was broadly that of economic life, which we met first in foundational courses on contracts, property, and torts, later in corporate law and antitrust. What we found here was that the major terms of scholarship and teaching served to bridge the institutional grit of private law with the heavenly concepts of general equilibrium theory. Confronted with a contractual structure, a labor or housing law, what should you ask? The answer was, first, are there transaction costs here that prevent the parties involved from moving their entitlements to the highest value use? Second, are there externalities that need accounting, ideally by bringing them within smooth transactions? To this list, we can add such problems as informational asymmetries and other declensions from the heaven of concepts. The basic task of a legal analyst concerned with economic order, we learned, was to identify these. The task of a legal engineer, to correct them by making the situation more closely resemble a frictionless series of exchanges in which, by definition, no one was made worse off, and resources, including time, attention, and labor, flowed to their highest value uses. The social world was reimagined as a web of bargains, some blocked, some consummated. Their consummation was our goal. In earlier generations, legal realists such as Robert Hale had described economic life as a field of legally constituted coercion, inevitably subject to state distribution, and by its nature in need of critical justification. In the new legal imaginary of society as more or less realized market, coercion, or power otherwise formulated, was absent at the level of definition. Bargains were bargains. To ask about distributional fairness or deservingness was a kind of solecism, or at least a gaucherie. If there were terms of justification here, they took the form of Caldor-Hicks efficiency, that is wealth maximization or so-called potential Pareto. A voluntary transaction, absent outweighing negative externalities, adds to social wealth by definition. Although few people defend wealth maximization per se as a measure of social well-being, or even wealth as a good in itself, pursuing potential Pareto transactions, regime by regime, comes to the same thing. At the same time, we who had come to study law, hoping to find there institutional expression of ideas about freedom, equality, and democracy, encountered those in areas of law that we came to understand as being, quote unquote, about fairness, or as being in some other way apart from the market. These included, for example, anti-discrimination law and criminal procedure, but their paradigm was constitutional law. These areas, too, came to seem deeply involved in naturalizing a certain version of the market. Let me say a little about how you may find that this part of the story is more politically national than the previous one. American constitutional law has defined equality in a narrow way that places some of its deepest forms beyond constitutional criticism. Since Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the doctrine of equality has been probably the most powerful single principle in US constitutional law. It's contributed to dismantling official racial segregation, forbidding different treatment for women and men, and establishing the right to same-sex marriage, as well as a broader immunity from persecution on the basis of sexual orientation. But in a watershed period between 1970 and 1978, the Supreme Court rejected what would have been among the furthest reaching and most material applications of the equality principle. First, it held in 1970 that there was no substantive constitutional protection of access to public benefits. It had seemed as recently as 1969 that the justices might be moving toward holding that there was indeed a fundamental constitutional interest in family support or access to medical care. Justice William Brennan introduced the idea in much the same way and at the same time that he was introducing the idea of gender equality to Supreme Court opinions. The two ideas were pretty much equally unprecedented in constitutional law. One bloomed, the other faded. In the same vein, the court held in 1973 that there was no constitutional interest in equal or adequate funding for public education, that highly unequal funding across school districts was just fine from the point of view of constitutional equality. It rejected arguments that the constitutional rights to free speech and voting should imply a constitutional interest in schooling to prepare to exercise those rights effectively. In the same case, Rodriguez v. San Antonio School District, the court ruled that there was no special constitutional scrutiny for policies that burden poor people. This would have been the doctrinal basis for courts to look into the effect on the poor of, for example, laws that penalize frequent moving in access to the ballot, to voting, moving frequently, which poorer people tend to do, or laws that restrict voting to working hours on a Tuesday when it's often hard for low-wage workers to show up. It would have provided scrutiny for property tax systems that enable wealthy places to maintain rich schools while poor places can hardly keep theirs running. After 1973, there was no basis to claim that economic inequality presented a constitutional problem, even when public policy was actively producing and reproducing it. Then in 1976, the court sharply restricted the reach of its most powerful equality doctrine, the principle of non-discrimination on the basis of race. The question was whether a policy raises a question of constitutional equality when, even though it doesn't treat people differently, explicitly or purposefully on a racial basis, it persistently produces different results in the aggregate and along racial lines. The case, Washington versus Davis, was a challenge to a hiring policy that included a verbal aptitude test that statistically scored Black applicants less well than white ones. The test scores had not been shown to correspond to job performance. The court ruled that the policy was fine unless it was adopted with the purpose of disadvantaging Black applicants. This made the race-class intersection in American economic life constitutionally invisible. This is portentous. Then as now, average Black household wealth was about 1/10 the wealth of the average white household. Black families tended to live in neighborhoods with less well-funded schools, where household wealth had been driven down for generations by redlining and other discriminatory policies. These dimensions of inequality grew out of the core of the Jim Crow system, which was both explicit racial tyranny and economic subordination, with Black Americans pressed legally and extra-legally toward the most vulnerable and least stable forms of work. If policies that put unequal burdens on non-white people had been open to constitutional challenge, governments would at least have had to explain themselves, at least had to think twice when their policies worked to keep things unequal. There would have been built-in pressure toward policy that uprooted an inheritance of inequality. Instead, the court issued a constitutional blank check for policies that reproduced that same inequality. One way to think about these decisions is in terms of the difference between two ideas, the constitutional foreground and the constitutional background. The foreground is the domain of overt official decisions that have to be justified in light of constitutional principles. The background is just there, taken as given. What happens there raises no constitutional question. These decisions press the following questions into the background: economic inequality and the intersection between economic inequality and race. This move turns the market, not as it's idealized in economic law, but as it has actually functioned institutionally as American racial capitalism, into the baseline, into the background of questions about equality, not itself an object of and a problem for those questions. This amounted to a constitutional naturalization of the results of American racial capitalism. The place you've ended up as a result of generations of that regime is the starting point for constitutional inquiry, rather than presenting problems of constitutional equality itself. So in these ways, constitutional law has protected the economy as a domain where intersectional forms of inequality are produced and reproduced. In other ways, constitutional law has affirmatively protected the exercise of economic power. The leading example is the court's use of the First Amendment right to free speech to protect election spending and other advertising and commercial transactions from public regulation. Starting in 1976 and proceeding more aggressively in the past decade or so, the court has treated campaign spending as protected speech that receives the highest level of constitutional defense. It has announced in particular that the Constitution does not tolerate campaign regulations that try to establish equal voice or influence among citizens by limiting spending. It has struck down limits on third-party independent expenditures in campaigns, on candidates using their own money even when they're very wealthy, on public financing of campaigns that use matching funds because these are thought to suppress private spending or punish it, and has struck down limits on the total campaign donations that any individual may make. Very large contributions, tens, hundreds of thousands of dollars for an individual. These First Amendment cases address the relationship between capitalism and democracy. They pose the question whether there is a constitutional right to translate wealth into political voice and influence. They say that there is such a right. Because markets tend to produce inequality that compounds over time, this amounts to saying that political voices will be unequal and will tend to get more unequal. The post-Watergate statute that the original 1976 case in this line gutted, and it did gut it, was an attempt to build national politics on the base of small donors and volunteers. The court ruled that this was an invalid effort to create a level playing field in politics, that civic equality, when pursued through limits on campaign spending, was not just not a constitutional value, it was an unconstitutional goal. When legislators have used language indicating that they are trying to create a level playing field, the court has taken this as an indication of constitutionally malign intent. Civic equality pursued through campaign finance regulations is constitutional anathema. How did the court justify these opinions? What conception of democracy was it advancing? The campaign finance cases are replete with phrases like a republic where the people are sovereign. That's the 1976 case, Buckley v. Vallejo, but you can find it everywhere. So there are affirmative and negative answers to this question. What conception of democracy the court is enshrining? Both are involved in the constitutional naturalization of market logics. So we'll take them in order. The affirmative answer centers on a market model of political reason that assimilates advertising to a very naive, perfect information model of consumer decisions. Justice Kennedy, in particular, wrote majority opinions treating politics as a kind of perfect market in which spending and advertising were simply ways of expressing arguments, and voters pursued their interests in light of the information that advertisers helpfully provided. But the negative register runs deeper, and what it expresses is not a naive market optimism about democratic politics, but a deep skepticism. The post-Watergate effort to get money out of politics that was under review in the 1976 Buckley v. Vallejo, the justices have argued, favored the parties and the candidates who could muster large volunteer networks, which then tended to be the Democrats and unions, and it curtailed the influence of outsiders who tended to be businessmen and financial elites wanting to get involved in politics, who used their money to break into the mix. As far as the justices were concerned, this sort of policy looked like picking winners, a violation of state neutrality, an invalid self-entrenchment. The self-entrenchment of the existing political class isn't a trivial concern, but as the concern was expressed in these, it was something more. The public choice theory of James Buchanan and the anti-political thought of Friedrich Hayek, who portrayed politics as a kind of organized bullying and looting on behalf of one's friends, homo economicus at play with other people's money. With the most fundamental questions of political economy thus recast as illicit favoritism, the allocation of political power, the role of unions in the economy, the scope of public provision, constitutional neutrality tends to mean leaving these matters to the market. And that version of neutrality, even if it avoided some measure of partisan entrenchment, did so at the cost of producing another form of entrenchment, class entrenchment. It cut directly at the capacity of political self-organization to stem the oligarchic tendency of concentrated wealth. And in this sense, of course, it was no neutrality at all. And in this sense, neutrality in the sense of the studied and consistent avoidance of distributional decisions is simply unavailable in principle to legal decision makers. This has been among the core contentions of the LPE response to the form of legal landscape that I've been describing. This juxtaposition of an idealizing naturalization of market logics in private law and a naturalization of market logics in the form of a skepticism of or cutting back of the egalitarian movements of constitutional and other forms of public law. To continue with the second, for just one more moment, we can see the same sort of dynamic in another area that's thought to be consummately about fairness, which is civil procedure. Here, a series of Supreme Court decisions have authorized contracts that redirect disputes into the private forums of arbitration. Originally designed and justified as a setting where sophisticated and mainly institutional actors could secure a congenial consistency. Private arbitration has become the judicial aspect of the corporate campus, a private court where employees and consumers submit their claims to officials chosen and paid by employers and producers. In this way, law has become a resource for engineering new hierarchies and reinforcing existing ones, using the ostensibly neutral and mutually beneficial form of the transaction, the arbitration agreement. If I've historicized a little how these analytic points that I've been elaborating, I take the narration of private law and public law that I've given to be a specification of the more abstract claims that I gave at the beginning, and then tried to locate in the intellectual, cultural, and political history in which they were formed and in which we came to them. I can now try to historicize the present just a little and say how I think the arguments that the LPE crowd has been making have caught the winds of events. These events include the rediscovery, so-called, of severe and widening inequality as a perennial feature of modern economies. We're now in 2021, 7+ years after the English translation of Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century. We're a decade out from Occupy. It's really hard to overstate how different the current recognition and thematization of inequality is from the 20 years before, when such talk was shamed in the mainstream as being crankish and driven by resentment, and in my setting as being un-American. The new empirical reckoning with economic inequality dramatically gives the lie to the adequacy of a market-modeled version of equality. So, for example, the naturalization of markets in constitutional equality doctrine. The fact that the racial wealth gap hasn't decreased and has sometimes increased isn't surprising when you consider that Piketty's R is greater than G has been the dominant reality for nearly 50 years, in which Black Americans have been formally equal as participants in economic life. A colorblind economy, even if its legal mechanisms work as designed, can be a profoundly racist economy if it carries forward differential wealth accumulation that was developed over centuries in which the national government was, not to put too fine a point on it, a white supremacist development authority. And indeed, that seems to be what our post-1970 political economy has done. Work elaborating the importance of these themes has included that of the empirical economist Raj Chetty, the sociologically trained law professor Monica Bell, who've both helped to show how these forms of inequality are written into geographies of vulnerability and opportunity, neighborhoods and regions where growing up there profoundly affects your exposure to schooling, policing, healthcare, pollution, and subtler kinds of neighborhood ecologies like trust, social networks, role models, the texture of life. These are also the legacies of law in which the material world carries forward the political legal decisions of a past time. Second, everyone knows that the Amazon economy gives an answer to a certain kind of modeling of the market. A modeling in which a neoclassical image of small-scale transactions and competition can simply be scaled up with little sensitivity to the kinds of advantages that may accrue to scale. Oligopoly and monopsony are what the younger generation likes to call its lived experience. Everyone knows this now. Third, the burgeoning climate crisis is a sort of object lesson, both that massive public infrastructure is needed and that it will inevitably involve public judgments about the character of value, about the kind of world that we want to have, the kind of work, the kind of lives that we want to foster in it, that can't just be read off of existing market outcomes in the manner of standard cost-benefit analysis. We, LPE people and our students, are the generations of Occupy, of the Sanders campaign, of Black Lives Matter, and of the pandemic. It's unimaginable to us, even more, I think, to them, that the state would not be everywhere, that distributional questions would not be ubiquitous, that the law would not either keep you alive or kill you. I'd say then that events have more than caught up with LPE. It was formed in critique, and now it finds itself in a different posture with the question, what to recommend? To the extent there's an answer, much of it will be formed in practice, just as much as it is in theory. One of the core members of early LPE efforts, Sabil Rahman, is now special counsel to the federal agencies that oversee the regulatory state and is trying in practical ways to ask what kind of social rationality can make disparate regulatory topics and strategies coherent if cost-benefit analysis is not simply the coin of the realm. Another of our core participants, Lena Khan, has been nominated to the Federal Trade Commission, where her work on conceptualizing market power in the digital economy will help to make concrete judgments and no doubt be shaped by those judgments. I could multiply examples, but instead let me step back to say just a little more about what I think LPE is doing. We're trying to take seriously the role of law at the heart of human interdependence. One way of understanding law, by no means a complete one or exclusive, is as a way of acknowledging the fact that humans are one another's problems and building ways for us to be one another's collaborators and friends. What makes us one another's problems? Well, first, we need the same things. In a world of finite resources, people need food and energy and shelter. And because these are not an infinite supply, there has to be some ground rules about who gets what. Every person must have a pretty good idea of what they may and may not use. And for everything that many people might want, there must be pretty clear answers as to who may and who may not use it. So wherever we would like the same things, we are in one another's way. What one of us gets past a certain point of sharing, the rest will not get. This is the first and simplest sense in which we are one another's problems. It's where Hobbes began and also where the very different tradition of David Hume began with his account of the conditions of justice. Next, we need one another. Most of what people do, we can't do alone. It isn't just that in a complex economy, most of us depend on other people's efforts for our food and shelter and energy, though that's true. It's also that our freedom is interdependent and relative. Although we're diverse species, most of us want things that require control of our own time and energy. And free time doesn't just arise like water from an artesian well. Much of what we call our time is doled out in advance. Working to live, working to service debt, working to keep our own houses in order. Any free hour rests in a web of other people's work. those who are keeping you fed, warm, sheltered, those who raised you or are raising your offspring, those who are picking up the garbage today or checking in on your parents or making sure the roads are patched or the subways are running. Free time is about as spontaneous and random as a cherry tree in St. Pauli Park or Central Park. And this goes all the more for work. Building something, a school, a farm, a tech platform, a magazine, a movement, a company, requires first and foremost command over other people's time and energy and ability. Almost nothing happens without many hands and many minds. And those whose plans come true are those who can command the hands and minds of others. The distinctive challenge of modern political economy is to generate a division of labor, because that's what we're talking about, among people who are, legally and formally speaking, obliged to approach one another as equals. The ways we organize ourselves, the answers we give to this problem, are inevitably, to return to my opening claims, expressions of power and forms of coercion. It's ordinary to think of coercion as something bad, to be avoided or eliminated, but to think clearly about law, we need to understand that coercion in this sense is inevitable. It certainly is a bad thing. It feels like a bad thing if it's happening to you. It's terrible to coerce another person gratuitously. When we think of coercion in these moral terms, we're often imagining personal coercion, like grabbing someone bodily or threatening them with a gun. But much of the coercion in everyday life, what I'm trying to describe, is not like this at all. It's structural coercion, and it is the music to our social dance. It's the ground on which we find one another. We take the jobs we do because of the options we have. We get the health care we do because of the insurance or wealth we have. We get the schooling we do, which may produce our job options or our insurance status, because of the neighborhoods where we grow up. In the moment we show up at a hospital and get cared for or get turned away or know better to show up, this kind of social distribution of lives is present. As I said, this kind of coercion, if we can call it that, is what organizes the allocation of time and the division of labor. It sorts us across the social landscape. It's how it comes that one of us is a day laborer or works at Walmart, while someone else lives on investments and someone else gets to talk about it. The silent sorting is much more effective sometimes than shouted orders could be. The architecture of this coordination, of this inevitable structural sorting that I'm calling coercion, is intricate. Lives are scripted by legal details such as which creditors collect first in a bankruptcy proceeding, or who is vulnerable to eviction and on what terms. Our shared lives are organized by these details at the deepest levels. The distinctive power of politics is to change these arrangements. Concretely, this can mean things like creating the power of ownership where there was no property before, like patents over medicine or bioengineering techniques. It can mean giving banks the power to produce money by issuing low margin loans. It can mean shaping labor markets with minimum wage laws, collective bargaining, laws favoring, supporting, or undercutting the creation of unions. To make these changes is to rearrange people on the landscape of cooperation and coercion. It always involves changes in law and its text and its interpretation. Politics, then, expressing itself in law, takes seriously the reality of other people in an interdependent world. Democracy is the politics that takes seriously the equality of all the people caught together in that world. It insists both that the question of how to organize our lives as one another's problems must be confronted as a live question, and that the answer must be premised on the equality of everyone who has to live with it. The law we're interested in is the law that either makes this practical democratic equality real or stands in the way. So let me end with a starting point. The question of what we mean by democracy and how that idea can be embodied institutionally in a common life are very, very hard. The neoliberalism that LPE has shaped itself by combating has been in the American setting mainly an anti-politics, a form of politics that denies its own political character and so takes questions of urgent importance off the table of democratic contestation. But neoliberalism's intellectual roots and affinities connect it with much more serious thinking about the functional limits of political engineering of the economy, about the perplexities and dangers of popular sovereignty, about the democratic deficit as a structural feature of modern life. These issues have mostly escaped the attention of LPE scholars and practitioners and activists, but they necessarily spring back to life at the moment that the questions LPE seeks to ask are revived. We know what questions we have to answer. We can see some of the inadequacy and bad faith of the answers that we've reluctantly inherited and have worked to fight our way out of. It remains much harder to say in what terms we're equipped to give better answers. So maybe we can start there. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk to you today.
Thank you, Jed Purdy. That was beautiful, as I am used to, and of course personally reminds me of long walks that you and I have taken together back when I was still in the United States, and of conversations that I had. I will also say I know of almost no other scholar who could, at almost no time's notice, because we had to invite Jed on very short notice, put together a presentation that is so beautiful and rounded. Thank you for that as well. For us, of course, it brings a nice continuation from yesterday's presentation by Jed's now colleague at Columbia University, Katharina Pistor. Like Katharina, Jed has argued that it is law that really creates, that makes our world, and that creates assets. Like Katharina, Jed and LPE point out that it's law that creates inequalities. And even more explicitly, perhaps, than Katharina, Jed has pointed out that it's the aim of LPE to revitalize politics, the political process, and democracy in order to change laws and, as a consequence, change inequalities and the world. I want to, in commenting, and I'll try to be briefer than my notes are, because my notes are too long. I want to comment on this, trying to see what I've in fact tried to do back when I was in the United States with Jed, to see how what he has told as a story translates outside of the United States. Because of course, and healthily so, Jed historicizes his developments, historicizes LPE, and that means puts it at a certain time and place. And the time is now, and the place is very much the United States. And I want to ask, what might change and what messages might we take from that by transporting some of the lessons from LPE to a European context? And I want to do that through briefly reminding ourselves of 3 recent decisions of the German Constitutional Court. In fact, all decisions from the last 2 weeks, in the same way in which Jed has focused a lot on Supreme Court decisions. The first issue concerns the relation between the state and the market. Ioannis Kampourakis, who has proposed to translate LPE into the European context, has suggested that what rules in Europe is not so much law and economics and general equilibrium theory, which Jed emphasized, but a certain type of ordoliberalism, not a market that is left alone by the state, but a market that is intricately interwoven with a state that nonetheless has in mind perfect outcomes. We know the debate in Germany about whether the German constitution is open to different economic models or not, a debate that has effectively implicitly been resolved in the sense that no, it is not open, even though it might theoretically be open. In fact, the Constitution is read in favor of a capitalist economy, a more or less hands-off economy, and indeed one that seems to favor strict enforcement of contracts and austerity. On April 21st, April 15th, I think it is, the Constitutional Court lifted its surprising and shocking ban on the European Recovery Fund that the European Central Bank had set up to finance its corona measures. And the German Constitutional Court had pointed out that this violates the constitutional competences that the European institutions have. So in one sense, this was just a decision aimed at competences and the relation between the nation state and the European Union. On the other hand, of course, it was a clear anti-regulatory decision, confining, even in the time of the crisis, the European Central Bank of taking necessary measures. In that sense, quite unlike a situation in the United States, where in crises, the idea that that banks have to provide lots of money is actually far less controversial than it is in Germany. And so we have an interesting conflict here, I think. The American state is willing to bail out quite fundamentally. It may bail out the wrong institutions, but we have seen in the United States that the state can interfere. And the Biden administration seems to suggest that such interference is possible again. Question in the European context, where the European Central Bank fights against states like not just Germany, but other states as well, is whether such interventions are indeed desired, or whether the ordoliberalism here is less willing yet to interfere than is the American state. That, of course, has to do with a certain idea of the public-private distinction, which is more vibrant in Europe and Germany than it is in the United States. And that brings me to the second point of comparison, the first one being the different roles of ordoliberalism or neoliberalism, and the second being indeed the distinction between the private and the public. That is a distinction that in the United States, in this European sense at least, is hardly tenable anymore. It's only mentioned almost with irony, and its death is much celebrated. Not so, of course, in Germany and in Europe, where such a distinction between private and public and between private law and public law remains alive. And we saw that again 2 weeks ago in a decision by the German Constitutional Court on the Berlin rent control law. As you remember, the Berlin Senate, in order to fight the extreme housing shortage in Berlin, established a quite intensive rent control law that was already raised concerns about its constitutionality. One such concern is familiar from the American context, and it is the sanctity of property and contract. That is, the concern was, could the government actually interfere with contractual freedom over rents? Could it interfere with the ownership rights of landlords vis-à-vis their tenants? The Constitutional Court, of course, the German Federal Constitutional Court, chose a different avenue to strike down the law, and it was again on the matter of competences, to say that the Berlin Senate, the Berlin government had no competence to legislate in this area because there was already conclusive legislation on the federal level. The primacy here of federal law over state law within its area of competences. Now, that was not as clear-cut as some people make it, of course. On the one hand, the federal government has the competence on matters of so-called civil law, bürgerliches Recht. On the other hand, it is up to the lender, to the individual lender, to regulate housing markets and crises in housing markets. And so the question was really, is rent control to be viewed formally as a matter of civil law, as a matter of contract law, and therefore conclusively regulated within the German Civil Code? Or is it to be understood functionally, as functionally aimed at easing tensions on the housing market, in which case it would belong to the lender? The Constitutional Court took the formal reasoning over the functional reasoning and established this on the basis of, said this is part of civil law. We have provisions on this in the German Civil Code. And as a consequence, the Berlin government has no remaining freedom to regulate housing markets. And so first, this is indeed a protection of private law over public law. And second, of course, it is an anti-regulatory move. Now, it's not the anti-regulatory move that says you cannot interfere with contract freedom altogether. It is the anti-regulatory move, however, that says there is a sanctity of private law which is not efficiency and equilibrium, but which is some kind of naturalized idea of justice, where indeed some kind of social oil, or socialist oil as it was called 120 years ago when the Civil Code was entered into, is allowable, but not too much of that. Some justice between the parties is possible in this, but regulations in favor of the public welfare are ruled impossible in this sense. And so that seems again to be a different framework within which questions of law and political economy play out in the German context than the context that we have in the United States. And my third Constitutional Court decision is the Constitutional Court decision of today that most of you will have seen, where the Constitutional Court struck down quite shockingly and quite excitingly the German, what's the title of it? The German Federal Climate Change Act as being insufficiently attuned to the interests of future generations, essentially saying you only made regulations until 2030 at the cost of what happens after that. You have to provide a plan also for the years after 2030, which also means you cannot borrow so much in the present from the future. It's a very exciting decision for many reasons. It's also going to be exciting to Jed, whose one of core interests, of course, is the Anthropocene, climate change law, etc. It falls short in one other way, however, and that's the question of standing. Standing was granted to private individuals bringing suit in their own interest. It was not granted to groups standing in the name of so-called rights of nature. Now, why is this relevant for me? Because it means ultimately what on matters of climate change the Constitutional Court responds to remain domestic German interests. So what climate change, of course, disproportionately affects is not so much the global north, but the global south. And yet the global south has no standing in a claim like this, at least. Again, in potential difference, at least from the United States, where at least until recently, quasi-world courts might have been available. And it's the global south in which I'd in fact be most interested how LPE would actually translate. Because Jed points out a lot about the distinctive power of politics is to change the arrangements that we have. And he says later, democracy is the politics that takes seriously the equality of all the people caught together in the world. But the question, of course, is whether that distinctive power of politics belongs disproportionately to the global north, which can take quasi-imperialist decisions as does the United States, or quasi-isolationist decisions as does Germany quite frequently. And whether democracy is indeed the politics that takes seriously the equality of all the people caught together in that world, or rather, as it is constituted at the moment, the equality of all people caught together within one national constituency, because that is where elections actually take place. And that leads to a question that I asked Katharina before. In what way are decisions to be taken for the global interest when our decision-making structures remain within national constituencies? We're used in the United States, and to some extent, of course, in Europe, to the idea that the law can indeed have great effects, although historically the United States has been more willing than has Europe or Germany in recent years to really make fundamental changes. But the question is, what does that mean for countries that do not make those choices themselves? Because their currencies are pegged to the US dollar, because much of their regulatory power has been traded away in investment treaties. So in other words, those are three questions of translation indeed. how does this translate to a European model of ordoliberalism? How does it translate to European distinction between private law and public law? And indeed, how does it translate to truly global concerns, including the global south? I put this out as a comment and of course also as questions to Jed, but also as an attempt to inspire further questions from our virtual audience in this translation process of a development that starts in the United States and that we certainly have a need for also in Europe. Thank you.
Rolf, thanks so much for that extraordinarily rich and also generous spirited response and invitation. I might say reciprocally to your very sweet first remark that this also reminds me of our walks and time together, and it feels very nice. So I'm very heartened by the set of invitations to translation, and I will, of course, as you implied, not seek to give a final answer to any of the dimensions that you invite us to travel along, but I will say something in response to each of them. It does seem to me, first, as an outsider, that ordoliberalism has been much deeper in its understanding of both the market and the state than many of the varieties of American politics that have fed into our neoliberalism. It, as I understand it, began in a significant way in recognition of the problem of economic concentration and of the translation of that concentration from economic to political life, and that one of the roles of the state is precisely to play the ongoing structural role that was written out of the place of the American state in the neoliberal transformation of antitrust in the second part of the 20th century. So in a peculiar way, an American looks at the ordoliberal regime with a combination of envy and terror. Envy, because certain kinds of destructive naivete about the market, even if they're offered in bad faith sometimes, never really get political traction. It's really understood how thoroughly the market is economically constituted and that it produces its own kinds of perennial dysfunctions which have to be averted legally. So there are, I think, American reformers who, without realizing it, substantially want ordoliberalism and understand this to be a kind of radical democratic or even populist move because it's supposed to involve breaking up the big concentrations. Ordoliberalism is therefore much more institutionally sophisticated and in some ways, to someone who wants a broader scope of political decision, a more profound opponent. It's also, I think, more ordoliberalism is more, it seems to me, self-aware about the relation between the efficiency producing dimension of markets and the kind of private morality dimension of their justification. Certainly in the American setting, one sees a sort of opportunistic or not even fully self-aware shifting of the ground in neoliberal arguments between an appeal to a rough approximation of general equilibrium to a kind of appeal to private morality, market as a version of justice or fairness on the transactional personal level to other registers. A sense that it's the best we can do, that political institutions are inherently dysfunctional, etc. But a full sort of synthesis of the elements of that rationalization, I think, have not been developed here to compete with the ordoliberal frame. So this suggests to me, again, as an outsider, that as you confront a deepening and sort of re-articulation of an ordoliberal frame in the face of a new generation of crises, the US, which has a less stable it has not had an austerity regime, really doesn't have an austerity regime now, and has a much less stable kind of institutional form to our market culture than ordoliberalism constitutes, at least at a sort of conceptual and ideological level. We may be moving into a very different sort of battlefield, one in which the questions of majoritarianisms, hazards and dysfunctions, and of the potential gap between what majorities can mobilize to demand and what the state can effectively provide, or what the rest of those who have to be governed by those majorities are willing to stand still for, the gap that may emerge between those political factors and the crises that may emerge in that gap. That is, the dysfunctions of democracy per se, rather than the economic and legal elites' cabinet of democratic potential may come to be our problems in the US very rapidly, which would put us in quite different ground to you. Two other things super quickly, because I'm saying more than I'd intended and want to be quiet. The formalist, we would say formalist in the US, basis of a couple of the decisions you mentioned on the basis of competences has a very close parallel in the US experience in the deployment of what are called federalism arguments in our constitutional jurisprudence, also ones of institutional competence, to eviscerate key portions of the maybe globally famous Obamacare Act of 2010, our most substantial healthcare reform in a couple of generations, and historically as a key piece of the rationalization of law as market protecting in our classically liberal Gilded Age jurisprudence. So this does seem to be a persistent pattern, which a certain kind of legal skepticism has always had to be deployed against across different systems of covertly substantive formalism. I will say last, I've saved for last what I think is really the deepest issue. It has a smaller and a larger dimension. The smaller dimension is the adjudication of climate, and the larger, amazing that that could be the smaller one. The larger one is to do with democracy's problem of scale or scope. To the first, I have been very skeptical in the US setting of efforts to judicialize the climate change problem in the name of the interest of future generations, because I think our courts have not done well speaking authoritatively on behalf of those who are not present, whether those are in the past, as originalists have done, or in the future. The interpretive substitution of an absent perspective in the place of authority for the decision of the current political majority has seemed to me to be usually unproductive and obscurantist in the US setting. And I'm not confident that the court's judgment in this front, our court's judgment, would be better here than it's been elsewhere. But this is connected with other work in which I've argued for the necessary sort of political thematization of very basic questions of ecological responsibility and value. And I might be wrong, I could certainly be talked out of it. To the last question, who is democracy? Democracy for whom? Who is caught together in what platforms or within what borders? I mostly just want to acknowledge the profundity of the question, and to say for what it's worth that I think it's one as to which any answer that can get traction has to be an answer that has an institutional correlate. That is, the fact that we're all caught in the world together doesn't tell us what to do without institutions that can channel majorities on a larger scale than the national scale, or political communities of mobilization on a larger scale than the national scale, into effective action. It is certainly the tragedy of our global situation that the unique institutional levers of political transformation remain those not only of the national state, but really only of a subset of national states. And I think we're fated in a way to try to build relatively internationalist politics on national platforms, because politics is a consummately artificial institutional forum, and we begin with the institutions that we're thrown into. That's not remotely satisfactory from the point of view of justification, but it just seems to me to sort of stipulate where we have to start thinking about that question. Thank you so much. It's a start.
Thank you, Jed. We now open the floor to other questions, some of which have already arrived on Zoom or via email. You can also, of course, use the comment section on YouTube if you have any questions. So one of the questions that has come up in several shapes, I suppose, is really regarding the LPE project and this kind of and I think that the way you contextualized it within the history of kind of the people who are involved in the history of politics and law is very persuasive. But the question that has come up is, in how far is LPE better placed to provide this criticism constructively than other movements, other public intellectual movements that have criticized the market, criticized the rationalism of economics, criticized the quantification of politics? So what distinguishes LPE from these perspectives? And maybe related to that, a question that I found quite interesting because I'd never thought of it coming from a law and society perspective is, why is LPE a project that is focused on law and educating law students and not about economics and educating economics students? So maybe those are interrelated, but I think we can maybe start the broadening of the discussion with that.
Those are wonderful, Tobias. Thank you for channeling them. Also, thank you for channeling the voice of your child in the background. Tobias and I were talking before we began about how we both have children in the background. Mine gave me this black eye, in case you were wondering where it came from. It's not in the words of the Clash. I fought neoliberalism and neoliberalism won. It's the future generations that won. I think it's very clear that the LPE effort owes a profound debt to political theorists, intellectual historians, critical race and gender theorists, critical theorists of capitalism, to name a few. And that our work is in no sense chthonic, in no sense born from the soil of law alone. Why is it worth doing in the setting of law? What is distinctive about doing it in the setting of law? I think above all, it is a point that I imagine Katerina Pistor presented to you very powerfully last night, and that someone like Lena Khan, whom I mentioned before, writing about antitrust, or someone like Abby Atkinson at UCLA writing about debt, or Monica Bell at Yale writing about neighborhoods would have made more vivid, which is that when we talk about the market or capitalism or the state, we're always talking about the concatenation of scores and hundreds of specific institutions and rules, hierarchies of creditor claims, as I mentioned before, thinking of Abby's work, etc. And really, until we see those and see how they work, we have only the loosest sense in some ways of what we're talking about. These sort of large-scale theorizations, I think, are valid. That is to say, LPE does not really share the view that many of those in the so-called critical legal studies movement of 50, 40 years ago took, that capitalism is not a thing. But it's a thing that's deeply institutionally specified, and the specification is really important. So that's one reason we think that it's worth our doing it, even more than someone sort of trying to theorize it at a general level, as I've been doing. It's worth doing in the nuts and bolts of antitrust or bankruptcy or whatever else. The second thing, economists, to answer in a slightly sideways fashion, we collaborate with people in economics departments and economically trained lawyers, and see ourselves as friends with younger economists who are combining more empirical and more critical work in ways that really are beginning in it again, as the institutional economists in the early part of the 20th century did, to think in a systematic and rigorous way about power distribution and so forth. So why do it with lawyers and not economists? So there's a certain amount, I guess, of path dependency. This is where we are. Lawyers are profoundly involved in the translation of political and ideological framings and mobilization into institutional life. And although law has been substantially colonized by a certain version of economics until recently, the more institutionally rich and power sensitive economics is, the more it actually has to benefit from conversation with law, because the kinds of things that lawyers do become relevant to those formulations. So that is how we think about that interaction, that junction.
Thank you. More specific question relates to the political economy part of LPE. And the question is, how does the LPE notion of power relate to other more political science or sociology-oriented approaches of political economy? So you call it law and political economy, and you have a specific conceptualization that came out clearly about the power of coercion, the power of the state and other actors. How does that relate to more traditional, more classical social science approaches of political economy?
Totally. I guess in some very parochial sense, we're being a little mischievous, and in a larger sense, I think we're involved in a kind of a project of recovery. The mischievous sense is the one in which is the following. The negative view of political democracy that I described the Supreme Court as taking, the skepticism of democracy that I described as the negative register of its campaign finance jurisprudence, is really consummate political economy in the sense that law professors and social scientists mean it when they ask about a question, what's the political economy of this? Where they basically mean, what is the dynamic of self-interested actors trying to get advantages through jockeying for control of public institutions? That is, where is Homo economicus playing with other people's money, as I put it. And in as much as that formulation tends, and I think no one has written about this better than Wendy Brown, to note a contemporary to whom we're indebted, is a sort of evacuation or evisceration of the very conceivability of the political public as a site of normative decisions that can lead to productive institutional transformations. We want, in a sense, to reverse that evacuation by putting the emphasis on political and saying that the ways in which the state makes the economy have to be explicitly thematized and criticized and justified in terms of the world that results. So putting the stress back on political also puts us back in the world of sort of 19th through early 20th century political economy, which was something like something closer to the theory of legislation, the outcome-sensitive theory of legislation, like what laws should a modern commercial society have and for what reasons. set of questions that everyone from James and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo to Marx were writing on. So we do want, in a sense, to say that if law is going to be up to the task, it needs to be sensitive to and in some conversation with political economy in that larger and older sense. And so there's a bit of nomenclature that we want to take back.
Thank you. Another question that has come up in different shapes or forms, and also that relates to Ralf Michaels, who might want to comment on this as well. Talking about the relevant actors that kind of you need to address, or that you need to get in line with. Both of you stressed the importance of high court decisions, and both of you also alluded from a sociological perspective to kind of the political nature of these decisions, and how kind of there's a problem with the judicialization of politics, but how kind of that is something that has been going on in the US kind of 120 years, and with the at least some of the European courts for the last 30 or 40 years. And of course, the judgments that you referred to are famous judgments of the Rehnquist court. So of a court that is relatively conservative and has kind of a dominant outlier that kind of runs the narrative in that sense. Is that something we're seeing now as well, or is that something that we need to take into consideration, Ralf, when we're thinking about the Constitutional Court and the European Court of Justice, or more? So, and how far is this kind of not just the judicialization of politics, but also kind of the inert political nature of high courts, something we need to be concerned about, and how do we deal with that? And maybe as a side, one of the constitutional judges in Germany is also someone who's very interested in kind of social legal studies. So how do you kind of relate kind of something like a law and political economy project to it, which kind of relates to the second question. If it's about policymaking, if it's about shaping the ideas of key kind of actors, if it's about kind of embedding yourself into the Biden administration to counsel, is this is law and political economy at the heart an elite project?
It's wonderful. I will say a little, and I'm so sorry that in a few moments I'll have to honor our ending time, because I actually have to go teach my property review section with our exam is tomorrow. So let me take it in reverse. Everyone on the elite question, everyone involved in the LPE movement, I think, accepts and embraces that we wouldn't have the kind of platform we've now had it not been for the last 10 plus years of social movement disruption and transformation. And there's some real sense in which the scope of the sayable and the thinkable and the ideologically, intellectually available is at least in a really formative interaction with a broader social life. So in that sense, no, that is, we don't think that elite arguments per se, especially progressive elite arguments, do much political work by themselves or necessarily do so. I do think that we think that ideas matter, and that the ideas of institutional elites matter a lot, and that they are worth contesting, and that they have a significant autonomy relative to other dimensions of politics, not a simple autonomy. And I think that principles in the PALS, the people involved in LPE, would disagree among ourselves as to how significant that autonomy is. But fundamentally, I guess I would say, most of us don't think of ourselves as sort of intellectual lawyers for politicians and movements, but we also don't imagine that we're doing work that somehow is in a hermetic isolation from work of that kind. Where the boundary lies seems more of a practical or historical question than a conceptual one. It would be foolish of us to pretend it's not a movement populated by elites. We don't pretend that it's one that is solely powered by them or could properly be exclusively concerned with them, nor do we think they could be ignored. It has been central to LPE to identify a good deal of judicial reasoning as a form of anti-politics in the sense that I defined during the lecture, a politics that denies its own political character and seeks to take certain questions off the table of politics more broadly. It's difficult for me as a non-comparativist, the deficit that I would like to address in my middle years, to step outside the US setting where the distortions are really over-determined by the age and rigidity of our Constitution and by our peculiar local culture of constitutional veneration, which together almost guarantee a certain kind of obscurantist elite politics of constitutional jurisprudence, one that moreover is persistently skewed to the right and to sort of demographically older versions of the US polity by features of our structural constitution having to do with who decides the shape of the Senate and in control of the White House, which jointly control the makeup of the Supreme Court. So that high court decisions are a form of politics we do broadly wish to assert. That politics is distorted in all of the ways we have tried to pick apart, has qualities that are, for us at least, very difficult to separate from the American setting, which on this front is not enviable. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really, really good to be with you and all the people I can't see.
Thank you so much, Jed, for a wonderful presentation and for really, like Ralph said, being able to provide us with these deep insights into your project kind of on such a short notice. It's been a pleasure, and I think Ralph, as discussant, should get the honors of the last words. But thank you so much.
No last words. I know you are a diligent teacher and don't want to come late for your class. Jed, thank you very much for coming to visit us virtually, hopefully in nature at some point soon. Yeah. And we can talk more comparative law when you cross the Atlantic then. Thank you very much. Have a good day. Thank you, everyone, for joining this day, perhaps also yesterday. Exciting things are happening. I'm glad that some of that happened on this screen. Good night, everyone.